Greetings, everybody. We're gonna let everybody log in and get situated for a couple seconds, and then we'll get started. So just hold tight. All right, I'm seeing a lot of people join us. Welcome. My name is Dr. Joe Henderson. I'm a visiting faculty member at the University of Vermont, and I am one of the scholars that works on the MEIS project. And the webinar today, so greetings from I'm currently just outside of New York City and have been participating in some of the Climate Week events. It's been very busy. A lot going on and a lot of energy around climate change education, which I think is really good to see. There's clearly a lot going on, both here in the US, here in New York, and then also around the world. And so on the MEIS project, in partnership with the National Wildlife Foundation, this seminar is titled Case Studies of Quality Climate Education from Around the World. And we're going to get into it because there's a bunch of presenters and presentations and really interesting stories of what's being done around the world. So next slide, please. We always like to begin on the MEIS project with a land acknowledgement, and this is a kind of general land acknowledgement. And so I would urge you all to think about the places and kind of the places where you are all joining from and the deep ancestral history of those places. And so we like to acknowledge that many of us are joining from the ancestral lands of indigenous peoples. We pay our respects to elders and knowledge keepers, past and present. And so hopefully we are all working in community with our neighbors. So next slide. Here is what this looks like and kind of the run of show for today. So we will start with Nicola Chopin from the MEIS project, and then we will get into the various case studies from Argentina, Canada, the United Kingdom. We will then bring it to New York State and think about something that I work on as well, which is climate education policy in New York State and what's going on in that case study. And then we'll have about 10 or 15 minutes towards the end for Q&A. And I just want to alert everybody to the fact that down in the bottom of your Zoom toolbar on the webinar, there's a couple of buttons that you might find useful. One of them is a Q&A button, so you can ask questions during the presentations, and people will do our best, likely after presentations, to answer those questions after they present. And then also notice the resource button as well. The resource button, as people are speaking, we will be turning on and off information about speakers, resources that they share that you can go to and download, and websites. And so please alert yourself to that, because there's going to be a rich variety of resources that are shared in that space. And so I will stop talking and turn it over to Nicola.
All right. Thank you, Joe, for the introduction, and thank you for the opportunity to come and speak with you today about the monitoring and evaluating climate communication and education, or MEIS projects research. The MEIS project is a partnership of over 100 organizations and academic institutions. UNESCO, the Global Education Monitoring Report, the UNFCCC, and IPCC all participate on our advisory committee. We are producing global indicators, country profiles, and case studies to help increase the quality and quantity of climate change communication and education, or CCE. Alyssa, can you please post our most recent progress report now? Our host, the Sustainability and Education Policy Network, is a global network specializing in rigorous, large-scale comparative research on sustainability and climate change in education. Next slide, please. The conversation about climate change tends to treat it as a scientific and technological challenge for the future. There is a sense that we're waiting for technological solutions to climate change to emerge, but we actually have the scientific and technological solutions to solve climate change now. What we are missing is the social and political will to address climate change at the scale and with the urgency required. Further, a future with climate change is one that is unequally distributed, since those countries, generations, companies, and individuals who are disproportionately causing climate change are also those least immediately impacted, and so are dragging their heels. Next slide, please. Polls do indicate that Americans are increasingly supportive of CCE and many types of climate action. However, the devil is in the details. For example, while a survey by Yale found fairly high support for regulating CO2 as a pollutant, survey respondents were less likely to agree that elected officials and citizens should do more to address climate change, with a rather strong partisan gap in some cases. Younger generations are more likely to support climate action. A survey of 10,000 young people, including the US, found that nearly half of American youth were either extremely or very worried about climate change. Nearly 70% were frightened by the future, and nearly 60% were anxious about climate change. This survey also found that American youth strongly distrust governments when it comes to climate change. And I should note that the US does tend to lag behind other countries on this issue. You can see here in the youth statistics that the US numbers are about 10% lower than the numbers for youth across all countries in the survey. So we know the challenge, we know what's at stake, we have the collective means to avoid the worst prognoses, and many of us agree that this is an important issue to address. Why aren't we taking the institutional action needed to enable a livable planet for all into the future? Next slide, please. The status quo for CCE globally and in the US is that education policy typically does not include climate change at the depth or breadth required. Most of the time, we tend to only learn facts about climate change in the curriculum rather than how we can take action. And climate initiatives are also often spearheaded by champions. Taken in combination, we often find patchy policy and practice environments that are more precarious and less effective than they could be. The MEES project has set out to identify what CCE looks like around the globe and to better understand what makes CCE effective in mobilizing climate action. Our findings show clear opportunities to shift how education is conceived and delivered to mobilize climate action at all levels, from children to teachers to parents to communities to government. So next, I'm going to discuss several global studies in relation to an analysis of education policies from all 50 states and Washington, D.C. Alyssa, can you please post the US landscape analysis report? My aim here is to provide you with a sense of the trends in CCE in the US and globally, and to provide some actionable, concrete ways to improve CCE uptake in policy and practice. Next slide, please. Globally, we find a lack of climate change content in education policies. In the US, out of the 800 or so state-level education policies we've analyzed, 17% mentioned climate change at least once. All states and Washington, D.C. did have policies that mentioned climate change at least once. On the right, you see a similar analysis found climate change content in only half or so of the national curricula of 100 countries studied. Next slide. What climate change content there is in education policies tends to be quite low and shallow. Our US state-level education policy analysis shows generally a very low uptake of climate change in the education policies analyzed. An analysis of science and social science curricula from 85 countries that we recently conducted found only 2% of countries had a moderate amount of climate change content. Next slide, please. Our analysis of American education policy found that 90% of climate change content was in teaching and learning policies, such as state standards and environmental literacy plans. However, effective CCE creates climate responsible cultures across all areas of school functioning. This whole school approach helps to ensure that climate action goes beyond teaching and learning. Alyssa, can you please pull up the whole school domains example resource? Incorporating climate action into how schools are governed, their operation, and community partnerships helps climate action become embedded in all areas of school life. One of our presenters will be speaking more to this later, so I won't go into too much detail. I will only say now that these whole school domains should be informed by place and community, including in relation to local Indigenous knowledges and the priorities of students and the school community. Next slide, please. Alyssa, can you please post the SEPN K-12 final report? One key benefit to climate responsible government in education is in distributing responsibility and leadership for climate action, which can help lead to transformative change. We have consistently found that single charismatic champions are often catalysts for climate policies and practices. In schools, this is often a teacher or an active year of students who develop climate initiatives, which frequently end when the champion is no longer at the school or burns out. This means that climate action becomes a patchwork of decentralized programs and initiatives. A key challenge then is building effective CCE at scale through policy and other means of advancing CCE across systems and societies. Next slide. Common approaches to CCE teaching and learning work with an information deficit model, which assumes that providing more information on the science of climate change will lead to action. But this has shown not to always be effective and can contribute to high levels of anxiety, hopelessness, or denial rather than meaningful change. This learning dimensions heuristic is used to help us consider whether and how teaching and learning are going beyond a focus on cognitive or fact-based learning. What motivates action is when education also engages learners psychosocially, for example, through participatory and social pedagogies. This means providing learners and teachers with tools and resources to cope with the varying emotional responses that come from an increased awareness of climate change. It also involves learners taking action that is meaningful to their communities and having action modeled for learners as part of curriculum. This can include attending or speaking at city council meetings, creating public art, undertaking emissions audits, and partnering with local Indigenous groups, for example. These three dimensions are connected and overlapping. Thinking is a type of doing, learners increase their knowledge of climate change through action, and so on. Next slide, please. So how do we better engage the psychosocial and action components of learning about climate change? Across a series of case studies of quality CCE across a variety of global locations and contexts, we have found that there are shared characteristics. Quality CCE focuses on relationships with the places where people live, including through understanding local impacts of climate change and in getting involved in action to address local climate impacts, relationships with the communities we live in, including connecting climate change to the existing values and priorities of community, supporting livelihoods, addressing politics, and attending to social justice. And finally, the stories that we tell about our places, communities, and climate change are central to making it matter to the things we already value so that we feel the need for action. These three elements are engaged in diverse ways across audiences, sectors, and regions around the world, which means that there is no one-size-fits-all approach to CCE. Next slide. So our next speakers represent three of these case studies that are helping unpack what makes CCE effective. The reports for the first two are available on our website. The last has just wrapped up and the report will be uploaded soon. We hope that these presentations provide ideas and inspirations for climate action in your contexts, whether they be inside or outside of the education system. Thank you.
All right, great. Thank you, Nicola. Next, I'm going to turn it over to Carla Sabatini, and Carla will do an introduction and take it from there.
Thank you very much, Joseph, Alisa, Nicola. It's a great pleasure to be here with you today. Thank you once again for this great opportunity to share our case study carried out in 2023 and co-authored by Jason Beach, who cannot join us today. We represent the UNESCO chair in Argentina on education for sustainability and global citizenship at Universidad de San Andrés in Buenos Aires. So what I would like to share with you briefly today is mostly understanding that over there there's largely an audience from the US, that this apparently small-scale story from somewhere very far away is actually an interesting, insightful, inspiring tale of a community forging bonds and coming together to address climate change. So I hope you will enjoy it. Next slide, please. So to begin with, just to briefly visually contextualize where the school is located, you can see South America, a few kilometers, like 350, 400 kilometers south of Buenos Aires, the capital city. And zooming in a bit more in the next slide, please. You can see that it's not at all an urban area. And you can see there's a big lagoon flowing gently into the sea. And on one of the banks, there's a very small town and a bit of farmlands. And then on the other bank, there's a huge natural reserve that is well known for its biodiversity. And the red dot over there in the outskirts of the small town is the school itself. So if we can move on to the next slide, please. As I will develop later on, I'd like to think of this story as three narratives actually braiding into one. One is the narrative of the lagoon itself. You can see another close-up picture there. It's a very well-known site because of its biodiversity. There's an amazing number of birds, and there's all this richness of wetlands and the coastal biosphere coming together. Which has been acknowledged for its value both as a Ramsar site and by UNESCO as a biosphere reserve. But it has also turned for the school into an outdoors classroom. As I'll explain later on, the school that is now the object of our case study is in fact much older, and it has been running since the early 60s. And it didn't used to be close to the lagoon, but even back then, kids were already very interested in looking after their environment. So the lagoon itself has always been like the heart of the community. Next slide, please. Next slide. Thank you. The other important thread in our three-part narrative is the building itself. Sorry, can we go back to the previous one? There, thank you. As you can see in the picture, the building is very peculiar. It is a self-sustainable building, and it was designed and constructed by the whole community itself, with kids involved, kids who actually then inhabited it as students. And the first batch of those students actually graduated last year. So as I said before, this is all about enlivening a sense of ownership and empowerment that is really in the heart of this story. As you can see in the picture, it is made from repurposed and reclaimed materials like timber, tires, bottles, cans, etc. And it has become like a living organism, and it's brought to life through connections and interactions with the world, because it actually collects its own water. The water in turn feeds the plants and nurtures the plants that make up the indoor garden, which regulates the temperature. So if one of the elements is not there, if somebody is not there to take care that the water flows and the gardens are actually nurtured, then the whole balance of the building itself goes off. So it's very important that from the very onset, students and families have understood this and have been hands-on, literally engaged in making it come to life. So this probably explains my last bullet very clearly, that there are very blurred borders between the built and the natural infrastructure of the school. So moving on to the case study now, you can see what the school looks like from the sky, and it's very pretty, but it is actually also very small. You can see the target audience that it caters for is all in all 120 primary school students who come in 2 shifts, morning and afternoon. Well, obviously the case study engages the local families and the local NGOs that have brought in the famous architect Michael Reynolds, who is responsible for designing this Earthship model that inspired the school. And it is in itself a one-of-a-kind project in Argentina, there's nothing like this. All public schools are usually built by the state and designed in a very standard kind of style all across the country, regardless of the peculiarities of the territory. So this ability of the building to blend with the landscape makes it particularly special. Next slide, please. If we can move on to the next slide. Thank you. The case study itself has consisted of on-site visits, interviewing the key stakeholders and analyzing key documents like teachers' plannings, founding documents, etc. And the findings mostly point out to this sense of ownership that I've already gone over, especially in the initial stage. Later on in the implementation scale, I did not mention that the school was opened in 2018, so it's fairly young. The crucial role of the school's leadership team was absolutely fantastic in keeping the project alive. And imagine that the pandemic in itself also brought very special tensions. And finally, the most important reflection has to do with the power of place and infrastructure. And we have further developed these ideas in a paper that is hopefully going to be published soon, co-authored with Marcia Mackenzie, and which was presented earlier this year at CIS. So next slide, please. I would also like to share that not everything is a fairy tale about this case study, like with every real territory. And we learned a lot also from some arising tensions having to do with the fact that infrastructure itself is very peculiar, but originally it wasn't specifically designed to house a school. The Earthship design provided by Michael Reynolds didn't necessarily easily fit in or house the kind of everyday routines that happen in a school. So what you see there, the bathroom, is a place where kids wash their tools, wash their artwork, and also their cutlery after eating. So that has led to, you see that unsightly building in process in the picture in the center above the picture with the kids. And that is going to be the future dining room of the school, because it has eventually proven to be very unpractical to have to use the toilet for a single purpose. Next slide, please. Just to sort of wrap up a little bit, the main conclusions of our case study point out to the importance of place-based education as a response to climate change. As I said before, in this case, the lagoon had always been like the heart of the school's pedagogical project. So when the original school building ended up proving to be too small for the community it catered for, and this opportunity came up in the hands of the local NGO to provide for a new house that would actually move them, a new home for the school that would actually move them closer to the lagoon. Everyone was absolutely delighted, because it was somehow fulfilling a long promise of actually enlivening this relationship with the lagoon that was so crucial. The community itself and their engagement were also a great part of the identity of the building, as the kids did not only get engaged in building the school itself, but they are also on a daily basis engaged in taking care of it. And one of their project-based learning activities consists of welcoming guests from all over the world to explain themselves as guides in guided tours how the building works, and so on and so forth. So this invites us to think about the great pedagogic possibilities that emerge when we reimagine the infrastructures of schooling in order to befit the demands of the Anthropocene, which anyway does not free us from the challenges of broader entanglements having to do with the legal, the material, and the affective, unsustainable infrastructures that still somehow underpin the school grammar of our public schools. So just to round off, if we can move on to the next slide, I like this idea of playing with the learning climate for climate learning. I think what makes this particular school so special is that some sustainability stems from the relationships themselves, and not only from the building and the everyday practices that have to do explicitly with climate change, but with the prevailing atmosphere for climate learning that is so positive and empowering. Just one last glimpse to say goodbye at the last picture in the next slide, please. And that's the whole community in the final day of the building process back in 2018. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Carla. That was so interesting. As somebody who's done some work around sustainable infrastructure, I'm just drawn to the joy in this picture, and it's really fun to see joy in this kind of work. And so I commend you all for that. A reminder to everybody, while we queue up Montana's presentation, so you could probably go to the next slide for that. Oh, there's Carla's information as well, if you would like to reach out. It is probably a good time to remind everybody that this is being recorded and can be accessed afterwards, and also to please put your Q&As into the chat if you have them, for people who have just presented, or if you need kind of more general information about the MEIS project or anything that Nicola said. So Montana, over to you.
Thanks very much. Hello, everybody. My name is Montana Burgess. I'm the Executive Director of Neighbors United. I use she or they pronouns. And Neighbors United has our headquarters in the West Kootenays in British Columbia, Canada, which is the traditional lands of the Sinixt people, who are not extinct, despite what our federal government says. And I'm really excited to be here today with all of you. I'm actually on the ground in New York for Climate Week and feeling very tired after doing this for 3 days. So I'm going to try to bring up my energy level to match the energy level of everyone else on this call. So before I get into it, I just wanted to share a little bit about why I do the work that I do. I grew up in a place called Kamloops. It's in the southern interior of British Columbia, Canada, and it's a really hot, dry place. It's a grassland. There's cactus, there's rattlesnakes, and so the summers are very hot. They've always been very hot, and it's very arid. So growing up in Kamloops, the forest fires were a frequent-ish thing, you know, because it's a grassland. It's meant to burn. That's how it stays a grassland. But there was only a handful of days in my childhood that were too smoky for me to go outside and enjoy the beautiful summer day. And I remember those days where the sun was glowing like that pink color, if you've ever had air pollution or forest fire. And the smoke in the air didn't feel good for my breathing. Fast forward, I became a grown-up and I left Kamloops, and I actually moved to the West Kootenay region where I live now. And one of the main reasons I moved there is because it's an inland temperate rainforest, which means it's a wetter place. And I was tired of the dryness and all of the things that come with that. So when I moved to that area in 2012, at first, the summers were quite lovely and temperate. And as I've seen over the last 10 years, they've become hotter and more smokier. And those of you that follow the global news and what goes on in British Columbia each summer, for the last, I don't know, maybe like 10 years now, every summer is smoky and hot, and the air is thick with smoke for about 6 weeks. And this is all unpleasant for me and for many people. But 6 years ago, I had a baby, and my baby grew up in the first 2 years. And one day, it was the day before Halloween, and she had a cold, and I was holding her, putting her to bed, and her breathing was very shallow and erratic. And anybody who's been a parent and you've seen your child struggle to breathe knows the fear and terror that come with that, from not being able to protect your baby and not knowing what's going on. So I called the ambulance. They came. They said, there's no way her oxygen is this low. Something's going on. They got her oxygen. We got to the hospital. She got all fixed up, but it turns out she has asthma. So every year now, when it's smoky for now 6 weeks, I can't let her go outside. I'm terrified of what could happen to her. And last year in British Columbia, there was an 8 or 9-year-old kid in 100 Mile in July, before it was even very smoky, who died from not being able to breathe because he had asthma and there was enough particulate in the air from the forest fires. So it's all very heavy, and it makes me feel scared, and it makes me feel just like my kid isn't going to have the same quality of life I had growing up in the summers. And then I also need to do everything we can to keep her alive and keep her breathing, having this kind of depressing indoor summer most of the time. And so that's why I do this work. I do it for her and the other kids that need a chance to breathe. Next slide, please. So the work Neighbors United does is based in something called deep canvassing. Deep canvassing comes from US social movements. It's a transformational engagement tactic instead of transactional. If you've ever done canvassing before, door-to-door canvassing, say hello in the chat, put your hand up, give a reaction. And those of you that have done kind of standard canvassing before, maybe for a political candidate or an issue, you're having a short conversation, right? You're trying to get a yes, no, or undecided, and then give them information if they're a yes or undecided, and then you're trying to get them to be mobilized and do a thing. Deep canvassing is like a 20-minute-ish conversation that's based in story, where the canvasser and the person on the doorstep are exchanging vulnerable stories drawn out by the canvasser to get grounded in lived experience on an issue. And we're using non-judgmental curiosity and really deep listening to understand what's going on for something, what's holding someone back from supporting an issue. And so in the work I do, it's around climate or environment issues and policies. And the outcome of this structured methodological conversation using a specific script and really specific skills developed from the canvasser around compassionate curiosity and non-judgmental listening, the result is that deep canvassing, people change their minds and it lasts. They're more supportive of a policy issue. About 1 in 3 people move on the doors. And this has been researched by academics out of Stanford and Yale. And it's the most long-lasting form of persuasion that has been studied. So it's a way to have a structured conversation with someone and bring them through their cognitive dissonance and out the other side more supportive of a policy that we need. Next slide, please. In deep canvassing, we are asking people on a scale of 0 to 10 where they stand on an issue at the beginning of conversation and at the end of the conversation. And if they move up the scale, that's how we're measuring the impact of persuasion. Next slide, please. So we piloted this work in a town called Trail, British Columbia. It's right on the border with the United States. It's kind of the headwaters of the Columbia River, if anyone's heard of that. It's a river that flows down through Portland, Oregon. And we were trying to get the city council in Trail to commit to the 100% renewable energy transition across community energy use, to do like our part for taking action on climate change in our own backyards. And we had done this in a bunch of other communities in the region, and we were able to identify our supporters and then get them to show their support, and the city council would pass this motion. In Trail, we couldn't find enough people. There was too many people conflicted because it's a town built around a smelter, so that classic jobs versus environment. So we had to have a whole bunch of these deep canvassing conversations to understand what people's conflict was and to help walk them through it. Next slide, please. We also did our deep canvassing work after that in Cranbrook, British Columbia, which is a town in beautiful Rockies, and it's a small town and a rural area. These are both relatively conservative, small c conservative towns. And here we were trying to understand how to walk people through their cognitive dissonance and to support ending tax breaks to oil and gas companies, a much bigger policy that isn't local government focused, but also one of the needed climate solutions. So these 2 places were our case study where we did our project. And at the heart of deep canvassing in this work is really about people educating themselves, but it's more about their feelings than about facts. Next slide, please. So we talked to people in these communities and we had our deep canvassing conversations. And then the thing we wanted to learn about was how do we take them after a deep canvassing conversation and escalate their involvement so they can get more involved in showing their support on the issue within their community by getting connected and organized with other folks, and also to decision makers and that kind of thing. So what we did is we wanted to test how to escalate people after the conversation and see how we could actually get them out to a community event. Could we take someone we talked to in a deep canvas conversation and get them to show up to a community event? So we had 3 treatments in our test. We tested emailing people that we had email contact for, and we tested sending direct mail to people that we had their address for. And then if we had both, we did both things. We also had a temporal treatment. So our deep canvassing started in Trail right before the pandemic, so a lot of pivots. And in Cranbrook, it ended the week before we actually did the mail out. So it was over a span of 38.5 months. And we were curious how long ago someone deep canvassed, if that had an effect on if they showed up to the community meeting we were asking them to attend. We also were curious about their support rating, so people that ended the deep canvas conversations on a scale of 0 to 10, so unsupportive, neutral, or supportive, those buckets I showed you on that other slide. If depending where they ended on the supporting scale, how would that affect them showing up to a community event? And you can see here this picture, it's our direct mail that we did. We hand wrote notes on the back of the community event invites. And we also sent them in the direct mail some communications, some stories through our magazine livinghere.ca that I'll put in the chat later, that take what we're hearing on the doors in the deep canvassing and put it in a solutions journalism context with relatable people from the community. So people are hearing the trusted messages through trusted messengers appealing to their demographics. Next slide, please. So the impact was, we had these two different places. We had 1,842 conversations, deep canvas conversations, and 1,209 of those were complete, where we got to ask them the scale rating twice. Others were partial, where we only got half. We sent 841 pieces of direct mail, which 760 were opened. We got a bunch of like bad addresses returned. And we sent 371 emails, of which we had 208 open. So we invited people to these events, and the direct mail treatment also got these Living Here stories printed in a nice magazine to like reinforce the narrative shift that they had happen at the door. Next slide, please. So what we found is 9 residents attended a community discussion out of all of that interaction. 8 of those who attended the event had received the direct mail treatment, and 7 of those were very supportive at the end of their deep canvassing conversation. Next slide, please. And so what we learned from doing this test, which first was all these deep canvas conversations and this direct mail, community event, email, outreach, we learned that if you send direct mail to engaged residents, they are more likely to take a next step in coming out to a high level ask, like showing up to an event or a community conversation on the theme that we talked to them about before. We also learned that the time since them having had that deep canvas conversation did not contribute to them being escalated. It didn't matter if we talked to them, it was like 3 years before or the day before, it didn't seem to have an effect. And we learned that only using direct mail to escalate residents who are in the supportive category at the beginning of the deep canvas and at the end of the deep canvas, so if they're like a strong supporter the whole way through, that's when we would recommend using direct mail. They are more likely to turn out. So kind of zeroing in how to use our resources effectively to engage with people, to help continue to educate them, and then bring them together to take climate action. Next slide, please. So we have all these learnings of our case study that we did in partnership with this wonderful group on our website here. I'll drop this link in the chat as well, but you can download it. It's a case study file in here. You'll have to get approval first, so it might take a few days for our team to do that. And we also have our full playbooks and toolkits from our deep canvassing in Trail, Cranbrook, and a whole bunch of others we've done since this time. So I hope there's some learning in there for you all to use in your work around educating and trying to bring people on board with the breadth of different policies we need in the climate and clean energy transition. Thanks so much.
Thank you so much, Montana. I really love the focus, especially on relationship building in communities where this work is very difficult. So I commend you for that work. Well done. In the interest of time, I want to move on to our next 2 panelists who are going to kind of go hand off back and forth. Bill Finnegan and Sachin Bhopal-Myers, they will introduce themselves and take it from here.
Brilliant. Thank you so much. So, hi there. My name is Sachin. I use he, him pronouns. Good afternoon from the UK. I appreciate most people are not in the UK. So, good morning maybe to you guys. But yeah, so my name is Sachin. I am a campaign coordinator for SOS UK and Teacher. Next slide, please. And so, yeah, welcome to SOS UK. So I'm going to give a bit of an introduction just to start with. So we are a youth-led environmental education charity, and we formed back in 2019 from formerly the National Union of Students Sustainability Department. So we work to support the education sector to champion climate education and adopt sustainable practices. So this is through programs such as Responsible Futures and Green Impact. We support young people to lead on tackling climate change. So this can be through many different campaigns, which I'll get into in a second. And we support the environmental sector to be more inclusive. So this is also through projects such as the Race Report and other projects similar to this. So the strand I work for is Green Schools Revolution. And now this campaign and this charity is particularly important to me because I've grown up with less of an interest in science, but a real interest in climate change and climate justice. And so I didn't really receive a quality climate education growing up. And so this is why I'm really interested in changing this, and hence why I now coordinate one of our campaigns. So, excuse me. Within Green Schools Revolution, we work with both primary and secondary schools, and we are focused. We focus our work in 2022 from our funding from the I Will Fund and the OVO Foundation, and we're running through until January of 2026. So our 4 strands include the Future Forum. So this brings together environmental industry leaders and young people to discuss how the environment sector can best represent and engage young people and young leaders. The other campaign we run is Wilding Schools. So this supports schools to wild and rewild 30% of their campuses by providing students with the training and expertise needed so they can create their own school wilding plans and bring nature back to their school campuses. We also run the Climate Action Plans, which is where we support students and connect them with industry leaders to help create a climate action plan for their school. Now, this is becoming mandatory across the UK, and so it's really important that we're able to support schools through this. And then finally, Teach the Teacher, which is what I work on, is where we empower young people to deliver a climate education workshop with their teachers by providing free training, resources, and support to students and pupils. Next slide, please. So Teach the Teacher has been working hard to support young people across the UK to engage their teachers in climate education and climate change. And we also now support trainee teachers in their local universities. So we work on climate change and the importance of climate education. Our student-led workshops cover the topics of climate change, climate justice, climate anxiety, and climate education. And through that, we cover lots of different areas of climate justice, climate change, and so on. And it's really important that we're able to give a full, well-rounded picture, which then we can, then teachers can be informed on. So the students who deliver these workshops gain really valuable green skills, and teachers who attend are provided with digital resources to help them easily but impactfully integrate climate into their classroom, no matter what subject they teach. We really appreciate that teachers are quite overworked, they have a lot going on, but by being able to give them these digital resources and the actual session only takes an hour, it makes it really easy for schools to get involved. So far, we've engaged almost 200 schools, with 50 sessions having been delivered already or scheduled to be delivered in the coming weeks. And we're also confirming lots and lots of schools at the moment. We've become very busy since the start of the term, which is a really good thing. It's really fun. So through our sessions, we have trained over 1,000 teachers and trainee teachers on the importance of climate education, and over 100 students have led workshops in their schools. And I will now pass over to Bill.
Great. Thank you very much, Sachin, for that. And it's been really a wonderful opportunity to be working with SOS UK on this case study. And also, I think just having Sachin here to help present this is really brilliant because, again, it's such a youth-led organization, and that goes from kind of what they're doing in Teach the Teacher, but also, again, the student staff often being students themselves in higher education, further education. Next slide, please. So I'm going to share a little bit about our kind of process on this case study and some of the things we've been finding. And again, this is a case study we've just wrapped up, so it'll be coming to the MEIS website very soon, and we're very excited about that. The main thing was that Teach the Teacher really gave us an opportunity to explore this question of what quality climate change education is with young people. And so kind of to engage them in what their vision is for the purpose, the practices, and the outcomes of climate education. And so that's kind of the core of what we're trying to do with this case study. And there's some mixed methods and a little bit of information there about kind of the different stakeholders in the program that we were working with. But I really want to focus on this methodology we used of digital storytelling, and something I've used in other research projects. And I think it's a really interesting opportunity to be basically delivering an educational intervention, a participatory, creative educational experience, while also collaborating on a research project and gathering data. And the data that comes out of it is really rich and really interesting. The other thing I'll mention, just because the resource popped up, one of the things to look out for in the work that Teach the Teacher, Teach the Future have done is their own advocacy for basically education reform in the UK. And that as examples of this are the resource there with the track changes review. So for this research project, these photos here are from a digital storytelling workshop we held in Scotland in June. And digital storytelling, there's a tradition of this that goes back to the Story Center in California, and originally in kind of community arts, and the idea that everyone has a story to tell, but we often only hear certain types of stories. And so to create a process where people could actually share their own story. And it's been used in various ways in community, international development, in higher education, in assessment, in other forms of engagement. And in research, again, it's an interesting process of gathering data. So what it looks like is over in this group in Scotland, it was over 2 days. It was a facilitated workshop. We were exploring climate change, exploring future scenarios, exploring communication skills, and then the students themselves created a first-person narrative responding to a couple of prompts, and then they turned that narrative into a video. So the output of this is a short video, about 2 to 3 minutes. And for them, it's again a chance of kind of engaging with these issues creatively, and that can live in other ways. That could be used in other educational programs. It could be used in their own campaigning. But it's also a chance for me to then explore the narratives of that data, the use of visuals, the kind of the themes that come through. Next slide, please. So in terms of those themes, the 2 prompts, just to say, one was looking back. So one was the students were encouraged to look back on their moment of environmental awakening. Again, these are young people who were active in environmental issues, and then write the story about that moment, share the story of that moment. And then there was a speculative prompt as well to project to the year 2050 and write a letter from their future self to their current self. So teasing out some of the themes from these videos that were produced in these digital storytelling workshops is kind of an indirect way of getting at some of these questions of quality climate education, different from just, scale, putting a scale in a questionnaire or responding in an interview. And so kind of reflecting on what I saw in these videos, when reflecting back on the moment of environmental awakening, formal education didn't really show up, but informal education that was represented in many ways. So for example, young people talking about David Attenborough documentaries, talking about social media posts about climate activists like Greta Thunberg, talking about their own forms of activism and action learning, and learning through action. And then also the relational side, which Nicola mentioned earlier, in terms of family and friends as well. When formal education showed up, it was extracurricular activities, eco clubs, school trips, or inspiring teachers. And looking at the speculative stories, the letters from the future, this again is maybe giving some insight into what young people are worried about is coming or hoping is coming, and what education can do to prepare them for that future, to navigate this time of uncertainty. And it's worth noting that most of these visions of the future were fairly negative. And when I've done this research before, it's been a bit more mixed. And in this set, most of the stories really were a warning from the future to the present. Now, there's a sense of this kind of contingency that, if we act, that future won't come to pass. But I also think it raises questions around what does it mean to teach people to navigate this time of change? And there's broad ideas about resilience and adaptation, but there might be specific skills related to food, to the growing and preparation of food, other things like that. 2 other themes just to mention briefly. There were mixed futures in terms of these themes of inequality and injustice, and the fact that actually the things that are playing out now will continue, and that some people will have the kind of green techno-optimist utopia, while other people will experience the dystopian future. And that's something I think that is a sign of more critical approaches to climate education, more intersectional approaches being really important. And the last thing to mention, and next slide, please, for this, was there was one positive future that was quite interesting. And but it wasn't a clean-cut narrative. It actually was more of a narrative of discontinuity. So it started with this idea that there was a great tragedy in 2030. And then after this great tragedy, it was kind of a reset. And it led to a period of restoration of nature and also transformation of education. And so I highlighted a few things from this vision of of a future education system in the UK. And in particular, this idea of learning in and about nature being such a strong element. Again, there's some practical skills around what does it mean to develop the ability to do that through the school system and through other forms of education. So these are some of the themes that came out. But again, next slide, you can see our contact details. We're very excited that this this case study will be published, and we can share some of the videos that the students created through these digital storytelling workshops as well. So thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Bill and Sachin. That was super interesting, and especially the attention to the kind of social, emotional, psychosocial dimensions of futures work, which I think is something that is certainly top of mind for all of us. I personally look forward to really learning more about that. So just a reminder to everybody on the webinar as well, we will send out resources and the recording of this afterwards. And so we've been mentioning a lot of things and sharing a lot of things. And so, you know, please reach out to these people, but also know that, you know, we'll share some more when there's time. This final case study, which comes out of the National Wildlife Federation and an organization near and dear to my heart that I work with, CREDIF, is about what's going on here in New York State and kind of the relationship building and the place-based work that is going on here. And so I will turn it over to my friend and colleague Elisa, who will take it away.
Thank you, Joe. Hi, everybody. Like Montana, I am also here in New York for Climate Week right now. And I've looked through the attendees and I see many members of our task force are here. So hello. So my name is Elisa Teles-Munoz and I'm the Senior Specialist for the Climate and Resilience Education Task Force, which is a project of the National Wildlife Federation. And like Joe said, today I'll be talking about the New York State movement for climate education. Next slide, please. So what is the task force? We call it the task force colloquially. It's an intergenerational community of students, educators, NGO partners, and community members who are dedicated to expanding access to interdisciplinary climate education in New York. And this is a group that's co-managed for National Wildlife Federation, and we act for environmental justice. The task force was created by my supervisor and mentor, Emily Fano. Cat crawling on my computer. By Emily Fano and other players in the climate education community in New York City in 2018. And since then, it has become a statewide coalition and community. So what is it exactly? It is a grassroots movement that is made up of the key stakeholders of climate change education in New York, which are students, informal educators, formal educators, and education specialists and NGOs across the state. It's also intergenerational with youth-led and youth-only spaces, as well as integrated spaces as well. And it's also a community for all that's centered around expanding climate change education and also the awareness of the importance of this issue and the lack of climate education that students receive in schools. Next slide, please. So these are the elements of our task force and the elements of our platform and vision. It was created by members of the task force over the course of almost 1 year. And we wanted to advocate for holistic climate change education, not just the changing of learning standards and checking off a box on part of the state saying we value climate education. We really wanted to create the blueprint for what implementation could look like at the state level. And so the key stakeholders that participated in the creation of this platform include the members of our task force, which are teachers, non-formal educators, and formal educators at the university level, etc. Some of whom I see here in the audience. I see Yadana's here, so shout out to you. She played a really important role here in the creation of this platform and vision. And we really wanted to create something that outlined what actually needs to happen. And so this platform actually ended up informing all of our advocacy efforts going forward, including the bill we introduced, which I'll discuss in a little bit. Next slide, please. So this is what our model actually looks like. The task force is made up of 4 core groups: the steering committee, the youth steering committee, working groups, primarily the policy committee, and task force members at large. And so this is really what our intergenerational model looks like. And I'll begin with the steering committee. This is comprised of a handful of individual core organizers that have been meeting regularly since 2021, at least in its current capacity, to determine projects of the task force, priorities, and general organization. And so currently it's made up of staff from National Wildlife Federation, including myself, staff from We Act for Environmental Justice, a high school teacher, a social studies high school teacher from New York City, an education professional from upstate New York, and a non-formal educator and policy fellow. And it's really important that our SteerCo is representative of the climate education landscape in New York and the people who are a part of it. The Youth Steering Committee is my favorite part of the task force. It's a group of high school students that I meet with weekly and mentor them. And the members of our Youth Steering Committee are students from New York City and also other parts of New York State that are motivated to take climate action, specifically with regard to education. The majority of our students tell us that they don't learn about climate change in school, or if they do, it's vague and limited to greenhouse gas emissions and in science classes. Other students have experienced in-depth climate education in their high schools, but it's often because they either attend a specialized high school or because they were lucky to have one or two teachers that really care and took extra steps to integrate CCE into their classrooms. And as Nicola was talking about, this highlights how CCE often happens in the United States inequitably. And I think she said a patchwork of decentralized programs and initiatives. And so the students in our youth steering committee are very aware of this inequity and want to expand access to other students in New York City and across the state. Our youth steering committee members help the CRETF spearhead advocacy efforts in New York State. And so they've pled their case for a holistic climate education policy and approach. And they've had their voices heard by the New York State Education Department, state senators, assembly members, city council members, the New York governor's office, the New York City mayor's office, the First Lady of New Jersey, and importantly by teachers across New York State. So this is really the core of our intergenerational grassroots model because they work with the working groups, which I'll discuss now. They've played a significant role in the success. Oh, sorry, one slide back, please. The working groups have played a significant role in the success of the task force, especially the policy committee. And it's actually a really beautiful community of which Joe, our moderator, is a part. It started off as an ad hoc group of volunteers, a professor at the University of Buffalo, a retired school teacher, a retired scientist, a climate science learning specialist from the Paleontological Research Institution, myself, my supervisor, Emily Fano, and other members of our steering committee. And it has since expanded to include other members of our task force as well. And so this group of advocates have pioneered the intergenerational grassroots model for CCE policy in New York. We drafted the state's most comprehensive climate education policy ever introduced. Along with members of the Youth Steering Committee, the policy committee has worked really hard for the last several years from scratch to make connections to the decision makers who are responsible for climate education in New York. Other committees that have existed include the one that helped to create the platform, which we saw on the previous slide, equity and justice, teacher support, and event planning. And finally, there's a body of over 400 individuals and organizations that make up the task force. Since it was founded in 2018, we've held regular coalition-wide meetings, now quarterly, and they're a mix between virtual and in-person. And we're really just trying to foster a community for climate education in New York State and showcase the broad landscape. Next slide, please. So this is, you can see our intergenerational community at work here. There's high school students, there's a fourth grade student on the bottom right picture, and also adults and allies to youth. And they've been meeting, they've been meeting with legislators for many years, but this was in our lobbying efforts in winter of 2023. They went, or 2024, excuse me, they went to Albany, the capital of New York, to really plead their case for climate education and make the legislators aware of the fact that they're not learning this in school. Next slide, please. Here's some more pictures of our youth taken with legislators and also more allies in our space. Next slide. I'll go quickly because I think we're running out of time. These are the policy priorities that were informed by our platform and the key components of our bill. That's updated learning exemplars, training for pre-service and in-service teachers, free resources and technical assistance, career and technical education programs specifically focused on training students for green careers, and a coordinating office for climate education and workforce development. And next slide, please. So finally, we've engaged hundreds of educators and supporters across New York, and this has been the success of our work, mobilizing people and creating a community of care and practice, and making folks in New York aware of the fact that students are just simply not learning about climate change in school in the way that they need to, which is an injustice to them, to animals, to plants, and the non-living members of New York State. And while our bill did not pass as written and introduced in the last legislative session, we're definitely going to capitalize on the momentum for this following legislative session. And we've had some great developments and good news on the horizon from the Education Department of New York. So thank you so much for taking the time to attend this webinar today. And I'll pass it back to Joe.
Thank you, Alyssa. And that was like, it's really beautiful to watch that and just think about all that we've accomplished and kind of what has yet to be accomplished. And one thing I would say too is we're kind of all in the middle of this here in New York State. And so as we think about New York State as a case study, we're just beginning the process of kind of analyzing this and writing some of it up for research audiences. And so I want to just give a quick shout out to one of the members of our group, Dr. Alexa Schindel at the University of Buffalo, who is kind of leading some of those efforts as well. And so to be continued. And I think we're here in New York. We've been working with the state education department, and it looks like we're getting really close to actually having some climate education policy that's holistic and takes, goes beyond the kind of just narrow cognitive dimensions of climate education. And so I want to just kind of say to everybody here, there's been a lot shared, and these are really excellent and interesting case studies. And so if you have questions, we have about 10-15 minutes. All of the presenters are still here. I think Sachin had to drop off, but so we're here to answer questions. If you have them, you can write them in the chat if you would like, and we can address those here. While people are thinking about some questions, I was thinking across all of the case studies and just want to kind of draw some through lines across the case studies because I think the benefit, I was trained in case study research, and so the benefit of case studies is that you get to go really deep into a particular manifestation of something in a place. And the beauty of that is to then think about what is transferable across places, and not generalizable, but transferable. And so what can we learn from each other? What are the shared kind of struggles that we have? And I really liked across all of these that they spoke to things that the Mies Project cares a lot about, which is going beyond the kind of narrow cognitive framing of climate education and really pushing us past this deficit orientation, which I think is just really, really important. A lot of attention across the case studies to the social emotional context. I will say that as like some of the work that we have done with Creative has been some of the most meaningful work I've ever done as a scholar. And it's been really helpful to be in community with people. And so you're all clearly in communities with people, and that's really important. I think especially when we're talking about climate change, that we're not alone in this and that we can actually do something. And then finally, that these things are action oriented, right? And they're action oriented with people in places. And some of those places are quite challenging contexts to work in, right? I work in conservative contexts as well. And so I think a lot about what does it look like to do that with grace and humility and kind of and thinking through the implications of that for climate education. You know, these are complex, emergent things, and we're all still in the middle of it. So I will leave it open to questions. And Emily, I know there was one that you would like to answer live, I believe.
No, somebody just asked, Elizabeth asked if we knew of any task forces like ours on the federal level, and I said that I didn't know of any, but if she finds out that they exist, please let us know.
Yeah, I think, Elisa, go ahead. Yeah.
I have a comment on that. So in the United States, of course, education is very much, it's a federation, and so it's very much at the state level. And there are certainly things similar to the task force in other states. Um, in Oregon, for example, there is a similar coalition, and in Florida as well. So at the state level, at the federal level, there is the North American Association for Environmental Education, which does similar work, but it's not necessarily a grassroots organizing campaign level, campaign at the federal level.
Yeah. Yeah, there's some ongoing scholarship on the Mies project about federated educational policy systems, and so expect more on that soon, hopefully. But it does add additional challenges to the United States context, and so challenges and opportunities, I should say, as well, right? Because one of the things that it's producing is people getting organized in their particular places, and so we're starting to see policies and models really bubble up in ways that you can't foresee at the national level. And so that I guess is the benefit of the federated system too. So yeah, I guess other questions or questions that panelists have for one another. We're all kind of taking a look at the so Alex asked a question, and maybe Nicola, can I direct this one to you? What are the main aspects of climate change education that go beyond the cognitive dimensions, while understanding there's no one size fit all?
Thanks, Joe. I had a feeling you were going to call on me for that one. It's a pretty complicated question at the end of the day. I think in terms of policy making, it's really important to make sure that these things are being entrenched and enshrined properly so that there's ongoing financial commitments, and that the policies are being developed with everybody in communities in mind. In terms of educators, I think that some of the stuff that I presented on at the end of my presentation in terms of making sure that you're really looking at your local context, using project-based, place-based, experiential learning approaches, in instilling connections to nature and land in local places. And in settler colonial contexts, like we are experiencing here in Canada, where I am, in the US, is really important to incorporate Indigenous knowledges and land-based learning when it's appropriate. Montana had a fantastic overview of the ways in which having non-judgmental conversations about climate is really important for shifting narratives. So that story aspect of, talking with people in the language that means the most, or that will resonate the most to them, telling stories that connect back to place and community. And then all situating within the community so that the learning can be connected with the values and the culture, attending to youth leadership, women's leadership, Indigenous leadership, and connecting intergenerationally as well, I think is really important. So if you think about, a whole school approach, and not just teaching the science of climate change and looking to, what can you do with arts? We have done a case study project in in Canada, where students in a school were collecting trash and developing protest art out of it when they were learning about climate change. Can you connect it to math in a formal education setting? There are really creative ways that you can do that. So I think I'll stop there. I'm happy to chat some more if anybody likes, and you can feel free to reach out to me as well.
Yeah, Bill, go ahead. You want to build off of that?
Yeah, just to build on that, because in our case study, we did also ask directly the students who participated in the focus groups their take on the purpose of climate education and the potential learner outcomes that you would see at the end of it and the teacher practices that could lead to that. And I was struck by the fact that for the learner outcomes, they did talk about just understanding the basics and being comfortable talking about the basics of climate change, again, causes, impacts, solutions. But when it came to the purpose was all about inspiration and hope. And that was, again, the kind of what they needed out of climate education. And so I think that, again, framed it slightly differently, because then when we talked about practices, it was cross-curricular approaches, it was more dialogue in the classroom, and it was, again, just finding other ways of engaging in, again, more local action. Again, all the things that Nicola was just saying, but it was in particular, well, actually, one particular thing was the balance between problem and solution, and teachers being very aware of that. And I think this comes at some stuff I've done on pedagogies of hope, which is that you really have to be honest about both of those things, that we have a serious problem and we have all the solutions, and you have to kind of hold that tension, because if you skew it one way or the other, there's a risk of doomism or techno-optimism, and you kind of have to hold both.
Yeah, Nicola.
Yeah, that is something that we're noticing frequently as well in conversations that we're having. It's very easy to get folks really scared and nervous and anxious about climate change. But if we're focusing on the solutions and what we can build together, then that you start developing a community, start feeling like you have more agency and empowering people to do individual, going beyond that individual action and feeling like you're just by yourself, noticing this massive existential problem. And I think that's a really powerful way to think about it, is not just thinking about what the problems is, but really being focused on solutions.
Yeah, and I think holding those things together at the same time, right? Because if you can't properly identify the problems, then you're misapplying solutions, right? And so, I've been thinking about this, especially after the event that many of us participated in last night here at, um, are we treating symptoms, or are we actually like getting to the root causes of climate issues? And I think that's something that we still need to get our heads around. Speaking of treating symptoms, my wife is a pediatrician, and there's actually a pediatric surgeon in the questions. I just put a quick link to the AAPs, the American Academy of Pediatrics, of which my wife is a member. There's a lot of interesting climate education increasingly going on in the medical community. And so medical journals are starting to publish quite a bit about this. And so I would just urge people to think about that as a site of education as well. We know that physicians are trusted narrators in people's lives. And so oftentimes what physicians say carries incredible cultural power. And so I know many of us work in schools and we think about those kinds of things, but education is happening all over the place in this domain. So I think probably one final question, and actually, Emily, I want to give you the last word. What are some of the kind of barriers and avenues of hope that we have here in New York State, specifically around policy, because we're right in the thick of it right now.
Yeah, I mean, I think the barriers are, our educational structure is very complex. It's very dissimilar to New Jersey, which passed a mandate for climate education because the governor essentially oversees the Board of Education, and the Board of Education passed a resolution to support a mandate, and it was done. Here we have a complex system with a Board of Regents, 17-member all volunteer Board of Regents who are elected by our assembly to serve 5-year terms. Many of them are retired educators, and they essentially set policy. our New York State Education Department, which is very lacking in capacity on all fronts, then establishes standards. And then every district, of which there are over 800 in our state, can decide how to implement those standards and determine their own curriculum. So sometimes, you might say that when things are, kind of diffused that way, that it gives folks a lot of autonomy. But in this case, it leads to, a lack of equity in climate education, a lack of standardization, a lack of scaled teacher training. And so I think that those are some of the barriers that we're facing. I mean, we need a lot more. Well, we need updated climate literacy standards, and we're working on that, as you mentioned. But we also need scaled teacher training in this space because teachers don't feel prepared to teach about this. And so that's one of our greatest challenges, I think, in addition to updating our standards, which are very antiquated. But I think we are finally at a place, as you mentioned, where the State Department of Education understands that this is something they can't ignore any longer. All of the states in the Northeast, our neighboring states, are jumping on this bandwagon, and we are quickly being left behind. And so there's definitely an agreement now that this has to happen, that our standards do need to be updated, and we are seen as a trusted partner in this space with the expertise that the department may be lacking. And so we are working with them very closely on a legislative package that would provide funding for staff and other things, a phased implementation plan over a few years to make sure that this is properly scaled at the state level in an equitable manner, so that teachers across the state understand the new standards when they become available, and that there is requisite teacher training to help them implement those standards in the classroom. And I would also add that we also need pre-service training for teachers who are studying to become teachers as well, and that's a huge need in our state as well.
Yeah, and I think I guess the last thing I would say, thank you for that, Emily, is I'm reminded of Marcy McKenzie's scholarship, really brilliant scholarship. She's the PI of the Mies project, and she has published and written quite brilliantly on the challenges of scale in these issues, from the global to the local, and I think we all have to live that. And so I just want to commend everybody for the good work that you're all doing, and thank you to everybody for coming today. And I know, this will live on beyond this webinar, and so let's stay in touch and let's keep doing the good work, right? Thank you, everybody.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you.